today our topic is going to be Iamblichus. So Iamblichus is Neoplatonism, philosopher, but he is also a practical magician and theurgist. So why this talk? In other words, really for this purpose, why did I choose out of my three Neoplatonists to really highlight? Why did I choose Iamblichus as one? Last week, we talked about Plotinus, who is the founder and is one of the world's great mystics. So what is it that made me choose Iamblichus? And really, it is that Iamblichus brings some things into Neoplatonism that were not there before, that are very influential in later Neoplatonism. In particular, he revitalizes the importance of the relationship with the gods and the spirits. So he is bringing back in more of a direct theocentric devotional element. With Plotinus, it was very, very abstract. And there's a lot to be said for that abstraction and the beauty of it. But with Iamblichus, you are able to bring back in more of this kind of personal devotional work and direct ritual work with the gods. It gives the gods, again, an important place. And also, it has places for all of the spirits and the relationships with spirits. And therefore, it also has a strong re-emphasis on ritual. And so this is different. This is different than Plotinus, and it is different from the Neoplatonists that are directly in the Platonian orbit, such as Porphyry. It's also, when I talked about in an earlier session when we were kind of talking about the trajectory of Neoplatonism, you do have, after Iamblichus, you have the Alexandrian school that rejects an awful lot of Iamblichus, in particular, this more devotional aspect and the ritual aspect, and that would be people like Hypatia and so forth. But Iamblichus is really the main one who brings in theurgy, and he's one of the main people in theurgetical traditions. So theurgy are methods of spiritual evolution and development, and we will talk more about that significantly during this talk, but that's one of the reasons why the innovations that come with Iamblichus are so important. And one of the things that I really appreciate about Iamblichus is that his work is a constant reminder to all of us on these kinds of paths to be open to the miraculous, to be open to being influenced and to recognizing the miraculous. So theurgy is literally God work. Theos, God, and then ergos, that's work. So this is God work, and it is contrasted to theology, which is God words, God talk, logos. You'll recognize in there, theos, logos. So these are practices then. They are various forms of spiritual practices that are aimed at divinization, the divinization of the soul, the evolution of the soul becoming more and more divine. And they are rooted in cosmic sympathy. And again, we'll talk more about this as a reminder, but sympathy is like sympathetic resonance here. And so these practices are rooted in this overarching cosmic sympathy that exists, but they are enabled by the grace of divine beings, the grace of the gods and of other spirits that are higher on the cosmic, really, cosmos, by the way, in the Greek, it actually means world. So it's more beyond that's like hypercosmos. It's even beyond the cosmos. It's all of these different hierarchies of beings. And so these compassionate beings who are more divine than we are able to impact us through grace. And Iamblichus is very clear that in his understanding, all wonders, all good things and all wonders come from the gods. So he has a very, very important place for the gods, the divine beings, not just like the one, but the divine beings in this kind of philosophy. So again, this is a reminder, we've gone through this, but just really quickly to put Iamblichus historically in his place here. You have Plato, 424 to 348, Aristotle, Stoics, and you have the Pythagoreans and the Neopythagoreans. Then we have Plotinus, who launches Neoplatonism. His main student is Porphyry, 234 to 305. And then we have Iamblichus, and Iamblichus and Porphyry, as we will discuss, have a very important relationship here. Iamblichus's dates are 245 to 325. So what that means is that Iamblichus is an adult. He is a peer at the time in which Porphyry, who is his teacher, they're also kind of peers. After Iamblichus, the next major one that we could touch on is Syrianus, who died in 437, and Syrianus's main student will be our topic for next time, Proclus, 412 to 485. So again, that's kind of where Iamblichus is sitting. So our source for the biography of Iamblichus comes from Eunapius. And what we know is that Iamblichus was born in northern Syria, in an area that was an important trading city. And we believe this to be Chalkis in Kole. There's a number of different cities called Chalkis. But this one it's at an important trading route junction. And he comes from a very prominent and a wealthy family. And very importantly, when you are reading Iamblichus and thinking about his relationship with the gods, the spirits, and ritual and so forth, is that in his family tradition, he is descended from the royal line of the priest kings of Emesa. And that is very, very influential, I would say, in his thinking. He's got a strong emphasis on these divine relationships, on religion as we would recognize it, on piety, and on ritual, and appropriately conducted ritual. He studied philosophy, and at some point, and it's not entirely clear, he becomes a student of Porphyry. Porphyry, again, is the main student of Plotinus. And he studied with Porphyry for some time, but eventually he left the school where Porphyry was the teacher, and he went back to Syria, and he opened his own school, probably in the city in Syria that is Apamea, where there was also an important Neo-Pythagorean school. So it already had kind of a reputation for drawing some philosophical types to it. And while he was there, he had a lot of patrons. He wrote a ton of commentaries, letters. He wrote a compendium of Pythagorean doctrine and the life of Pythagoras. And of course, as I said, he is enmeshed in an overarching society there that has a very strong Neo-Pythagorean influence. And the context in which Iamblichus is writing is very strongly religious, but it's very strongly religious in a Hellenistic way. And I know I've mentioned this a few times prior, but it really cannot be said enough that Hellenistic times, so after Alexander the Great, and then it carries on through Rome, you have this extraordinary cultural mashup that is going from India, it is all over the Near and Middle East, it is down into large swaths of Africa, it is all over Eastern Europe, Southern Europe, all of this area. You have this kind of combination, this heavily syncretic combination in which people are recognizing, the gods in each other. So they're trying to find this notion of, you have Hermes, and then you see the Egyptian god Tahuti, and you say, oh, well, those are just appearances of the same divine being, and they're actually one being. And let us learn from each other and mash all of these things together and take the best from everything. So this is where you have the birth of cosmopolitanism. Cosmopolis means that the cosmos itself, the entire cosmos, is your polis, it is your city. And so this very cosmopolitan understanding. And part of that is that you have very prominently these collections of texts and religious manuals that are really in vogue during this period. And that includes what we now know as the Papyri Graecae Magica, the PGM is what most of us call it. Sometimes they're called the Greek Magical Papyri. They're actually, most of them were found down in Egypt, in Hellenistic Egypt, but they're tons and tons of spells and incantations and all sorts of things that are really interesting. There's the Chaldean oracles. There's the Corpus Hermeticum. This is where you have a whole bunch of texts that are attributed to Hermes Trismegistus and a lot of various kinds of Neoplatonic, in a lot of ways, or Platonic and they influence a lot of Neoplatonism and then have that baked back in on the other side. So a lot of philosophy in there as well, and the Emerald Tablet of Hermes. So there's all of this stuff is floating around. Is very important. So for this particular talk, the three texts that I'm really drawing on, I'm giving you the citations here. You'll get the slides later, so you don't have to madly write it down. But De Mysteriis is like the main one. Now, interestingly, these texts are in Greek, but they've been given Latin titles at some point. So that's not their original title, but that's what we call them at any rate. So, and the translation that I'm using is the Clark, Dillon, and Hirschfeld. And then De Anima, which is mostly, it's meant to be a commentary on Aristotle, but it has a lot more in it. And actually, it helps you understand more of what's in De Mysteriis. And then the Life of Pythagoras, I also found interesting because he is explaining Pythagoras as kind of a model of this very kind of pious philosophical life. So the text De Mysteriis is the main one that we're going to be looking at here that's really driving this. And the context for it is that there is a letter written by Porphyry of Tyre, who was the teacher of Iamblichus. And then, like I said, they had a rupture, they had a split. And Porphyry writes a letter that is called the Letter to Anibo. And there's a couple of things to know about Porphyry. And I mentioned some of them last time. Like I said, he was the main teacher of Plotinus, and he was very strictly Platonian in many ways. So it was his belief that contemplation of the sort that we talked about with Plotinus is sufficient to reach the divine. And so he does not believe that there is anything else necessary, and that therefore we should be primarily focused on learning and practicing these forms of contemplation, that he experienced at least once a mystical ecstasis with, and that Plotinus was in ecstasis a fair amount. His understanding of philosophy and of the divine is highly abstract, as we saw in Plotinus. And Porphyry takes on to that. He is very, what he thinks of as anti-superstitious. And he believes that most of these practices in those texts that I was mentioning, like the PGM and the Chaldean oracles, he believes that those are not divine, that those are superstition, and they are distracting us from the true work, which is this contemplative path that will take us to the one. So he writes a letter to Anibo. Now, Anibo is presumably in the letter that Porphyry writes, an Egyptian priest. But whether it is fiction or not, we don't know. We don't know whether or not this is something where, which was not uncommon in the time, to have these characters that are taken on. So as an example, and I think I mentioned this before, Hermes Trismegistus is the name that pretty much any Egyptian priest would use when writing a tractate. It was like an act of devotion to attribute to Hermes Trismegistus. But there are other times in which people would write letters under these various pseudonyms or to fictitious characters as a way of providing context for their philosophical work. So what we don't know for sure is whether or not Anibo actually exists. But in the context of the letter, in the frame of the letter, Anibo is an Egyptian priest who in some way is related to Iamblichus as perhaps a student. And we don't know whether or not Anibo was an actual student of Iamblichus. But this letter is really cutting. And so the letter itself, and I should mention that one of Porphyry's skills is asking incredibly pointed and sometimes devastating questions. That is one of the things that he was really, really known for. And in fact, he wrote another tractate that was called Against the Christians. And every single copy of this thing has been destroyed. And it was destroyed by the Christian church at the time because it was such a devastating critique of Christianity. So anyway, he is using those skills to clearly attack Iamblichus, but he's doing it in this kind of weird sideways way of writing this letter to an Egyptian priest in which he is asking a ton of questions that are clearly meant to discredit Iamblichus. So Iamblichus believes that the letter is aimed at him, and he answers the letter, which is what De Mysteriis is. And the answer that he gives is under his own character that he has created of the Master Abamon, who is a senior priest to Anibo. And so, like I mentioned, this kind of anonymous and pseudonymous authorship was very common, and in other contexts would have been considered pious. So he's writing this response in which he is going point by point through the questions asked by Porphyry, and he is answering in an equally cutting kind of way. And part of what he is doing in the process of this is providing a philosophical basis and a defense of theurgy, which ultimately is what Porphyry is so upset about and is trying to critique. So after Iamblichus, Neoplatonism takes on far more of a religious character, this defense of the gods, defense of ritual, defense of God work. Like I said, it's a little bit less so in the Alexandrian school where they reject a lot of Iamblichus, but certainly in the Athenian school, which becomes extremely prominent, and in other schools that really kind of take up where Iamblichus leaves off, they become very explicitly religious. And this also includes the work of Julian the Emperor, known to Christians as Julian the Apostate, where he is trying to rebirth paganism through this Neoplatonic lens. And so that is part of what is going on there. So I want to give a cosmological, ontological overview. I think at this point we're used to the fact that in Neoplatonism, cosmology is ontology. But I want to go through a bit because there are some things in Iamblichus that are different than in Plotinus. First of all of Neoplatonism, even if they have various other forms of elaboration or other forms of disagreement, are ultimately embracing an emanatory ontology. And in any of these schemes, which, the emanation is one of the main things that you then see from Neoplatonism as it works its way into eventually all sorts of other esoteric traditions. Emanation, also sometimes called procession, always involves both a lessening of power through descent while the entities are multiplying. So that is always related. You have the multiplication of entities simultaneous to the diminution of power in any of those entities. And that's just an important characteristic to understand whenever we're looking at emanation. So again, with Iamblichus, we have the ineffable one, this unity that's also kind of beyond the one of Plotinus is what he does, because he says that, Plotinus says the one and the good are the same. And Iamblichus says, well, then if you can have any attribute at all, then that is not it. And so we have to go back a bit further. And then he also has this notion, which is picked up later in terms of the proliferation of intermediary beings. There's the realm of the one. And this ends up creating kind of a second one that is still one, but it's a second one. And that second one is limit and unlimit and is also the good. So if you go into, and like I said, I'm not a Kabbalist, I translate in and out, but I don't think in Kabbalah. When you're getting into the Ein, Sof, Ein, Sophor, that kind of thing. Or the other thing is like in Hinduism where they talk about Nirguna Brahman and then Saguna Brahman. So Brahman completely without attributes, totally like the void and all that. And then Saguna Brahman, which is still one, it's still all that, but it's beginning to have a little bit, like not really character, but there's like the seeds of it. So in the realm of the one, you have, as I mentioned, this limit, the unlimit, the good, and you have the one existence. So these are all still the one, but they're kind of having these different aspects almost. The one existent is the one being. And in this one being, there are two aspects. So there's paradigm, which is the model on which all of reality is built. And then there's aeon, which is eternity. So that is not time, it's not chronos, it's aeon is eternity, it is outside of time. And in the Iamblichus system, the system of Iamblichus, the lowest level on any of these things, so he's got some elaborations of building in, these kind of other levels. The lowest on any major level is also the highest of the next level. So that is the place that is creating kind of a bridge. And this maybe will be a little bit more sensible in a moment. So we have the one, and then we have, like I said, these kind of aspects of the one. And from there, from this would be paradigm and aeon, we have the intelligibles. Okay, so the intelligibles, and this can be thought of as the contents of the divine mind. So this is kind of like the nous. So the intelligibles are those things that can be thought of. So they don't exactly do the thinking, they can be thought of. And then when we get to the next level, the intellectives, those are the ones that are doing the thinking. So again, the one being in the aspect of paradigm and aeon is both the highest of the intelligibles and the lowest of like the realm of the one. And so these intelligible gods then are given the name henads or enads. It really just comes from the ena, which is one. It means one still. So these are kind of the ones. And so the intelligible gods, and these are still extremely abstract, extremely, extremely abstract. And then the lowest in that level is the celestial demiurge. So those who know their Plato will recognize the demiurge from the Timaeus. And this is the creator being when we get into anything that we would recognize as creation, because everything above this is more abstract. It's not actually beginning into manifestation yet. So as I said, the intelligibles are those things that can be thought of. The intellectives are the ones that are doing the thinking. So now we're talking about the realm of the intellect. And so again, with that, the lowest in one level is the highest in the next. That's the celestial demiurge. So these are the powers that can do the thinking, and they can think of and contemplate the intelligibles. And so from the celestial demiurge, then we have the gods that we would kind of begin to recognize as the gods. And this is partially a way to reconcile the theology and the practices and the relationships with the traditional gods and where they fit into this. So we have a number of types of gods here. They're basically immaterial, ethereal, which are considered the highest. Then there's the Empyrean. Empyrean is the fiery aspects of heaven. The celestial gods are interesting in that they're the ones to me that in a way that are interesting. They kind of create this interesting bridge. The celestial gods, he's talking about the stars. He's talking about the stars as beings. He's talking about the astrological beings. And so they do in some way have a body in that when we see a star, that is a body. And of course, the sun is our star. But that's only this teeny tiny little piece of what they are, because that's only them on the physical world realm. So the celestial are beginning to cross over into something that we would recognize as having form. But like I said, that part is like this big out of like their entire huge range of being. And that's important to note. And they are considered in this way, like real beings, full beings. So it's also important to note that at the ethereal, Empyrean, and celestial level, and also in the in cosmic, which are in some way related to matter, that these beings have retinues of lower classes of spiritual beings. So you're starting to see this notion of kind of what's called seriae or chains. So you have, very abstract, and then you'll have one of the gods, and the god will begin to have, lesser gods and angels and all sorts of things that are coming down into these hierarchies that are also expressions then of that being. So I just wanted to be clear about that, because sometimes it gets a little confusing with the celestial gods and the stars, but there we are. So the incosmic gods are in some way related to matter. These would be the gods that are related to things like agriculture and stuff like that, where they actually have some direct relationship with the physical world. And Iamblichus, I got to say, Iamblichus loves hierarchy. So these are schemes of hierarchy. And like I said, we have this idea of Syrii, of the chains. So let's say that you have, there's an aspect of Apollon that is one of the really, really high gods. And he's one of the ones who is one of the really, really high gods. And so then you would have under him, there are other gods, more minor gods, still very important, like Asclepios and the Muses and all of them. They're all under Apollon's chain. And then you would get into the archangels and you would get into angels from there. So angelos, I mean, we always think of these as being kind of like Hebrew and Christian, but angelos, it means messenger. So this is also there in those traditions as well. So these are, beings that are of a different class, a different nature. They have this kind of they're in a chain because they kind of have to report to somebody, but they also have some administrative functions within the workings of reality. And the angels in particular, this class that we call the angels, the angelos, they're especially good at purifying things. That's something that Iamblichus talks about a lot. Then you have the cosmic archons. Archon is just a word that means leader, and the daimons, and then the hylic archons that actually rule over matter. So there's a fair amount of stuff in here if you do a lot of study of like Theosophy or the Bailey traditions or some of the Hindu traditions. You start to see some of these hierarchies and they kind of start to map on in interesting ways. These notions of different beings that have some administrative function over reality that are also related and kind of report up. And so finally, then you get to the humans. So you go through all these and you get down to the human realm. And the humans, there are different types as well. So one of them are the heroes. And the heroes are beings that they're kind of almost on that bridge of being like the next class up. Again, with that, the lowest class down, they're the lowest class of the group above is the highest class of the group below. So the heroes are kind of that liminal boundary place. But they also do have to incarnate. And then you have the purified souls. These are the souls that have gotten themselves very clean of anything that is not of their soul nature. Most of us are mixed in that we have kind of combination of, there's some stuff that we still need to work on, but we also have a lot that, we're kind of doing well with. And then there's the unevolved souls. And those are the ones that just, they have not yet really evolved, but most of us are in the mixed category. So, and I'll get into the soul a bit more in a minute, but this notion of the hierarchy of divine beings within the cosmos, which is so central to not just Iamblichian philosophy, but also to the practice of theurgy, is that all of these higher order beings have lower order beings in their retinue who we can work with and who have administration over various kinds of things. And that those superior classes of beings, as I said, they have specific things that they're supposed to be doing. So as I mentioned before, an example is that there's a very, very big, really hypercosmic version of Apollon, who is, among other things, the musician who plays the music of the spheres, that kind of thing. And then all of his retinue all the way down, that comes all the way down into certain humans. So there's this link all the way through. The gods have absolute full control of all their vehicles all the time. But as you move down the hierarchy, the beings further down have less until by the time we are humans, at which point we really have kind of a struggle, so that we do not have naturally large amounts of control over our vehicles. And part of what we're doing in the purification and growth and practice is developing further control over those vehicles. And again, everything is operating within the entire system of reality on sympathy. everything is woven together. Sympathy is what brings everything together and holds it in a cohesion. So sympathy is actually a Greek word, sympathia, and it literally means to feel with. And so this is my own personal like bugaboo, but like when people are like, oh, sympathy means to pity, but empathy means to feel with. No, sympathy means to feel with. That is literally what it means. Sympathos means to feel with. But think about it in terms of sympathetic vibration. And I know I mentioned this before, but it's just really useful to keep it in mind. If you go to a piano, you hit a middle C, the C's on the rest of the octaves are going to vibrate. And that's the way in which reality works. We always talk about this is how correspondence works, by the way. So correspondence, it's not just that we're making stuff up and we're like, oh, well, we think this is this. It's correspondence. If you have it right, it means that you are hitting a note really hard with whatever it is, and all the other things that are in that kind of chain that vibrate at a similar rate are also going to be activated. And so this is part of effective magic, is knowing when your correspondence is true versus when your correspondence is kind of culturally created that may or may not be accurate. So that's part of it. So everything is held together by sympathy. Now I want to talk some about the Iamblichian understanding about the nature of the soul. And this has to do with the human soul. So the human soul is dual. It has two different things that it's always doing. It is not always intelligizing, because if it was, then it would just be intellect. It wouldn't be soul. At the same time, it does intelligize, because if it didn't do that at all, then it would be an animal soul. So it has this dual nature all the time. And its purpose is to be a mediator between the higher entities and those entities that are corporeal, those entities that are embedded and enmeshed in matter. So the soul emanates from intellect. And it is both intellect-like and animal-like, but neither state is permanent. It is always moving and shifting between these two. And if it didn't, it wouldn't be fulfilling its function. And this is quite different than Plotinus. And I want to draw some attention to it. Because what it means is that human lives have to have two lives. Human souls have to have two lives. They have to have the life of the intellect, otherwise they're not fulfilled. They also have to have the life of nature, otherwise they're not fulfilled and they're not fulfilling their purpose. And all human souls, therefore, must incarnate periodically. Because if they did not incarnate periodically, then they would not be fulfilling their cosmic role as mediator between the intellect and the world that includes matter and form. Iamblichus, like all Neoplatonists, believe in reincarnation, really all Platonists. And the metaphor here that's used of reincarnation is a bulb, like a tulip or a daffodil or something. And so for those who are not gardeners, when a bulb is fully in bloom, if you were to dig up that bulb, there's really not much there. It's poured all of its resources and its essence into the plant that is now active. And then when it dies, it comes back down and it gets consolidated into the bulb. So, all of those experiences and energy and everything goes back and are now part of the bulb. So what that's saying is when we are in incarnation, we are pouring all of ourselves, pretty much all of our essence, into being here now. And our role is to be this mediator, because we always exist on these higher levels as well as the lower. And then in between incarnations, we are into a different state in which we are not involved in matter. So the pure souls are those that are fully purified. They don't have any of the miasma, they don't have any of the pollution, any of the things that are distorting their highest nature. And they descend at will in order to be of service to the world. Now, the difference between a pure soul and a bodhisattva is that a bodhisattva, they both choose to come into incarnation in order to be of service in the world. But a bodhisattva could conceivably say, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to remain in my transcendent state. And because the nature of humans is that we must come into incarnation periodically, that is not the same kind of choice in that way. So you have a choice of when you descend, you choose to descend, but you also at some point, there's something in you that will always make you descend in order to be of service if you are a purified soul. The unevolved souls come into incarnation, and their purpose of incarnation is to receive correction and punishment for past incarnations because they just have not learned enough yet. So it's kind of like that notion that if you have to be of a certain level of development, and you can think of like childhood development where logic will work. If you're not there, then kind of the other forms of punishment that create aversion are still necessary. And so those are the unevolved souls. But the emphasis on this is on cleansing. The emphasis of the experiences that we should be having for the unevolved souls, as they're calling them, is cleansing. Now, we are all developing and we're moving through these things. Most of us are in this mixed category. And what that means is that we're not fully pure souls, but we are also capable of doing work for our spiritual development. We're capable of learning more. We've like gotten through the path where we need to do kind of aversion therapy. And we're making progress through our practice. So we are both serving the world while also still needing to learn some things. And that's where the vast majority of us are. After death and before rebirth is also a period of purification, of cleaning away the stuff that is not soul, that has like accreted to us, kind of the pollution and so forth. So the goal then of spiritual development in this type of a system is that there are three main advantages that humans gain, and they gain them from the gods. Again, this is grace because we're part of these hierarchies, and they gain them from the gods and by the practice of theurgy. One of them is illumination. Now, this understanding of the nature of light is spiritual essence. That is there. It's also truth. It's, there's a number of different things that are kind of interesting. One of the this is a bit of a tangent, but like I love J.R.R. Tolkien. I think he's amazing, and there are things in there that I find fascinating. And one of the things that he was, of course, a linguist that he was playing around with is the nature of language. And part of what he was very moved by was actually a person called Owen Barfield, who was an anthroposophist and therefore has some link into Theosophy, with this notion that at some point in time, when you have a word like pneuma, which we know, which means wind, it means breath, it means spirit. So at some point in time, those are not three different meanings of the same word. That is an experience that is the same thing. And so this understanding of light, that is spirit, that is the essence of divinity, that is also truth in its highest form, that these things actually are the same thing. So you're having this experience then of having divine illumination, of having divine essence come into you as grace from the gods. And there's also this notion of kind of common achievement of projects in working with like-minded people who are doing this kind of spiritual work and working with the various kinds of spirit beings. And there's the perfect fulfillment of the soul through fire is another thing that he says. Now, in the Chaldean sense, fire is the immaterial fire of divine power. So again, this is kind of related. And in ancient Hellenic traditions, fire is divinizing, and divine fire burns away mortality. And you see this in the mysteries, you see it in Eleusinian mysteries, you see it in various other kinds of myths and so forth. So these are the things that we're trying to do. And basically it's bringing in more of this divine power into ourselves on all these different levels. So the soul's ascent then is that our goal is to cleanse the soul so that it can again ascend into the realm of intellect. So getting rid of all of the things, or purifying, really getting in alignment and purifying those things that are that will keep us in alignment with intellect. So cleaning away anything that is not part of soul. And it then unites with the God that is in that chain while retaining his own identity. Because again, remember, when we're talking about those chains, part of what's happening there is that each of us is actually part of a chain. We have a natural inclination, and you can see this again in other kinds of things later in other traditions, things like the rays, various things like that, where you're trying to figure out what is your true ray. It's a similar kind of thing where you're all part of some sort of a hierarchy. And so figuring out what the right chain is so that you will then be able to proceed in the appropriate way and have this unity with the God that is ultimately, in this way, your source. So you have unity with the God, but you retain your own identity. It doesn't get subsumed by the God. And we have here a quote from Iamblichus in his commentary on De Anima. Souls that are successfully purified rise to the sphere of the angels and assist the gods in administering the universe. So again, if you are able to successfully do that, then you are raised up above this kind of human level, and you're beginning to work with the higher beings in alignment with whatever that chain is that is also your individual true nature. Iamblichus argues very strenuously in his kind of pseudonymous fight with Porphyry, who's pretending to write to an Egyptian priest, about the limitations of just practicing philosophy without this other kind of ritual practice, without this devotional practice. So again, Plotinus and Porphyry, they strongly believe that you can do all of the spiritual development through contemplation alone. Once you go up, as we talked about last time, with the various kinds of meditation, and then once you reach Nous, you surrender, and that's when you have this ecstatic union with the One. Iamblichus says, knowledge of divinity is not the same thing as knowledge of something else, and he strongly argues for the importance of grace and a place for divine revelation. And again, if we will remember, Iamblichus comes from a priestly background. So it is his belief that humans are just too weak to ascend alone, or at least the vast, vast, vast majority of us are. But that in their benevolence, the gods gave us methods for salvation, and that these methods for salvation were made accessible in ritual form, that's what ritual is actually about. And so let us consider Theurgy. Let's talk a little bit about the functions of Theurgy as Iamblichus understands them. First of all, the practice of Theurgy is about purification of the soul. And I think I mentioned this before, but catharsis, when we talk about catharsis, that's kathari, it's actually to cleanse. That's what it means. So this includes then practices that allow us to purify ourselves before death. After death, there is a major purification, but we can prepare ourselves and should be preparing ourselves by regular purifications. And this includes purification that protects against the influence of bad spirits, of spirits that are kind of going to draw us off our path. And it also then, these practices of Theurgy prepare the mind for participation in and experiencing the vision of the good, which is a divine vision. So, we don't just usually walk into something and have the divine vision, the divine unity with much of anything if we haven't done some preparatory work. So that is part of what this is about. It releases, through these purification practices, everything that opposes the good. In this way, we're using the good as the divine, everything that opposes the good in the mind. And this union with these greater beings all the way up the hierarchy from the gods up to the demiurge, but rarely we get past and into the one. That's usually not where we end up. We usually end up in our ascent, in Iamblichian thinking, in unity with one of the gods. So part of what's happening is as we are rising up those hierarchies, we are attaching the human ethereal vehicle to the vehicle of the god in whose retinue you are already or then attached. So again, part of this is about discovering your true nature and which of these hierarchies, which of these series are you actually a part of? And I'll say for myself, as I understand myself to be part of the retinue and working in kind of an apprenticeship and trying very hard to do what I can, but still clearly a mixed soul, still lots of growth to happen. But I understand myself as being in the chain of the god Apollon. Like I said, way down, human, mixed soul. But that helps me know kind of when I'm on my path and when I'm not. So one of the things that I find very powerful about Iamblichus is this notion that the divine presence is in the world, and part of what is happening is that it's almost like here's this veil that we're not always aware of, and there's these places where the gods, because they have this benevolence, they have this grace, they're like breaking through, they're poking through into it. And if we can recognize it and grab on to one of those strands, those threads that they're sending down, then we can break through those barriers that are there. And I at least find this to be very powerful. And again, this notion of compassion and grace that is there and the benevolent love of the gods. So some of them there's oracles in the ancient tradition, which they're in a number of different traditions. In the Greek, the main oracular god is Apollo, but there's also in lots of different gods send dreams. So these God sent dreams, these dreams that I talk about them as being like the really big dreams, those ones that you come out of and you're like, that was not normal stuff. There's something else going on. And I find those in every tradition. And one of the things that I find very fascinating, I have known many different people across many different traditions, but being able to talk about big dreams, that makes it something that you can bond with people across traditions about, because almost everyone has them, but they don't always know how to talk about them. But there's also within the cultures that Iamblichus is talking about, there's a ritual complex that is the sacrifice ritual. And I want to go out and say straight up, I do not think it is a good idea for us to revive sacrificing animals. I just don't think that would work and be appropriate in our particular culture. But then again, most of the sacrificial rituals did not actually involve sacrificing animals. So there is a ritual complex. It does have to do with the symbolic manifestation of divine fire, because part of what they're doing is they are putting things on the divine fire. And what happens is in this entire ritual that is always, it can be done in household level, and individual level, but it could also be done at entire community level. It is making the entire ritual through this kind of summoning and creation of the divine fire. It divinizes the entire situation, but it also divinizes all the people who are participating in it. There are epiphanies, and this is when the presence of a god is made tangible in some way to you. And so there's a lot of different types of this. I think of epiphany as a little bit stronger than an oracle, but an oracle is something that would also fall into this, where the god is kind of breaking through and is leaving you a message. So one of the things, I'll just give you a personal example. Sometimes when I'm like feeling really down on myself, like I'm not doing a good enough job trying to learn, I feel like I'm, not whatever, almost inevitably within about 10 minutes of that, somebody will walk by me with something that says Apollo on it. Which is, I take that. I'm so grateful. He's so kind. This kind of like, okay, this reassurance. But, that sort of thing, when you start paying attention, there are these moments that, they're breaking through in some way. Prayers are very important as a form of this that's breaking through. And of course, in these traditions, they have particular ways of praying that we'll get into, some of the invocations that are actually working to create this sort of channel. And then there's the nonsense names. So there's a Greek term, barbaro which means any of the names that are not one of the Greek names, because babara, barbarica, where we get barbarian, it just means non-Greek. And so there's a few different things. There's sometimes where you are recognizing the non-Greek name of a deity that you know, but it also can be these kinds of in some of those manuals and those texts, these kind of weird how do I put it? Lots of different syllables, this sort of thing. Like the stuff that looks like it's nonsense names. But what's going on there is there's something that's tonal that you're hitting in some way that is actually resonating on that sympathy with the vibration that is that chain. So there's a lot of that in some of the Hellenistic manuals. And then there's the symbols, that real symbols are these kind of cards that are these threads that are being dropped through the veil, that if you can actually grab one, you can take it up outside that veil. So this idea of symbols and signs is absolutely critical for theurgy. And I want to be clear that this is not the postmodern symbols and signs as language games. This is not Wittgenstein. That's not what we're talking about. We're not talking about the random culturally constructed stuff. In ancient Greek poetic culture, the sema, which is usually what is then translated into symbol, is a gift. And again, it's a gift, and it is grace, and it is something that is puncturing that veil into this realm. So there's a few different things that you have to do in order to be able to grab a hold of it. First of all, you have to recognize that something is a sign in this way and correctly understand it. So that's the first thing. And in order to do that, you also have to then be morally qualified. So you have to be morally good enough to be able to like really grab a hold. And then you have to be emotionally qualified. You have to be moved by it. But if you can connect to it, then through it, you can connect to the high reality of whatever being that is who gifted the sign. And they're all over. And I think that's one of the things that I find so beautiful about this is that these signs, these sacred symbols, because there's so much grace, because there's so much love on the part of the gods, that they're just all over the place if we can recognize them. But we have to be open. And so that reminder at the very beginning of be open to wonder is part of what Iamblichus is calling us to. So in the practice of theurgy, then, it has a dual aspect. It is performed by humans. These are actions that are performed by humans. It is God work. But it controls or uses these divine symbols, the sema, these gifts, and this enables the humans who are doing this work to harmonize with the divine beings and to begin raising themselves up into a state of union. And one of the things to remember when you're using these sacred symbols is what you touch touches you. It is a mutual relationship. So finding the divine symbols and doing this kind of practice, what you touch then touches you. It changes you. There is, in anything that is kind of this old ritual style, there is a natural conservatism, and Iamblichus certainly has it. And that is the understanding that theurgy is both human and the gods. It's coming from the gods originally, but it's things that we do. We have to be very careful about altering ancient rites, because when you're altering ancient rites, you might rupture the power that comes from the divine. And if you rupture the power that comes from the divine, you will undo the efficacy of the rite. So this is a very different kind of approach than those people who are doing totally modern constructions of stuff. Now, I'm going to say again, I don't think it is a good idea in our context for us to be rebirthing the sacrifice ritual in terms of sacrificing animals. There's a whole variety of reasons, which I could give you if anyone wants to ask me a question, but I don't think it's a good idea. But the question is, as we're going through, so that automatically means that we're changing something, and that may be necessary. And I can tell you, having studied a lot of ancient Greek religion, there are changes over time. But I think this kind of natural conservatism of trying to figure out what are the pieces of this that are actually the gifts from the divine that make it work, that are actually the pieces that are connecting us through sympathy and through, the part that was gifted, so that we don't undermine what it is that we're attempting to do. So invocations. This is an important part of my practice. And if anyone has a devotional aspect as part of their practice, I recommend it. It's a very powerful piece. So when you're invoking one of the gods or one of the divine beings, however it is, you're not summoning them. That's not really what you're doing. What you're doing is you're calling up your own soul, and you're aligning yourself with the being that you're calling. And then you're asking for grace. You're asking for presence and grace, which is then given. So invocation and prayer practice is one of the most powerful forms of spiritual practice. And that can either be alone or in the context of another ritual. And in fact, it is the only requirement in any of the ancient Greek traditions, is that you never do a rite without doing a prayer or an invocation. I mean, there's nothing, if you don't do one of those things, if you don't, basically it's invocation is a form of prayer, then you haven't really done a rite. So that is there in everything. It is also the most foundational form of theurgy, of God work. And traditional prayers, when you go back and you look at traditional prayers, they include some of the signs from the gods. They include those things that are the gifts that come through. One of the things, in case this is of interest to anyone who is not me, I look at the epithets. I think that's one of the places that you often see these various signs that are gifts, are in the epithets in traditional prayer form. So this is a quote from Iamblichus here. I declare then that the first degree of prayer is the introductory. So this is kind of a frame for how to do prayer in his form, which leads to contact and acquaintance with the divine. The second is conjunctive, producing a union of sympathetic minds and calling forth benefactions sent down by the gods, even before we express our requests, while achieving whole courses of action, even before we think of them. The most perfect, finally, has as its mark ineffable unification, which establishes all authority in the gods and provides that our soul rests completely in them. So this is not a particular prayer. This is an evolution of prayer practice. As you are doing prayer practice more and more, this is kind of the stages of that. And actually, let me go back here. I have another quote that I find useful. This is on invocations. For the illumination that comes about as a result of invocations is self-revelatory and self-willed, and is far removed from being drawn down by force, but rather proceeds to manifestation by reasons of its own energy and perfection, and is as far superior to human voluntary motion as the divine will of the good is to life of ordinary deliberation and choice. It is by virtue of such will, then, that the gods, in their benevolence and their graciousness, unstintingly shed their light upon theurgists, summoning up their souls in themselves and orchestrating their union with them, accustoming them, even while still in a body, to detach themselves from their bodies and to turn themselves towards their eternal and intelligible first principle. So this is an answer to one of Porphyry's charges of like, well, why would a human be able to control the gods by calling them? And he's saying, that's not what's going on there at all. You have completely misunderstood the entire situation, Porphyry. And what's really happening is that when we are calling they, because they have divine grace, are reaching down to us and really pulling up our soul. So we like open this way and say that we're willing and ask for help, and they're pulling us up out of our bodies and into union with them, and that's really what's happening. So rituals then are gifted to us by the gods. And these he's thinking here of traditional rituals. Sacrifice, as I said, there's a sacrifice that is a very important one in those cultures, and that is one type. But really, any of the traditional rituals focus on raising us up, and the ritual, raising the ritual up to the level of the divine. And what we're doing then is we're using those symbols, which are, again, divine gifts. You know, the word dora, gift, is there. Using these divine gifts to attune ourselves to the gods. When we're calling to the great ones and to other divine beings, we're also then in these rituals focusing on purifying our own soul and leaving behind anything that is not part of our intellective soul. So part of, you know, those higher aspects of self. Now, one thing that he notes in rituals is that when you are doing a ritual for a transcendent god, that you don't actually need material objects for sacrifice. But if you're working with one of the encosmic gods, then the ritual should be more physical. So there is a difference between doing a ritual for a god that is more abstract, Zeus or whoever, and one that is for a being. Like if you're doing a harvest ritual where you're trying to get a good harvest and you're working with Demeter, that's going to be a more physical ritual. So, you know, how much physicality is brought in is appropriate to the type of ritual and the beings that you're working with. One of the types of practices that is in Theurgy is the creation of talismans and enlivened statues. And these are physical items that become receptacles for divine light. So they become like a holding place for divine light to shine through and to operate through. Talismans are created for a particular purpose and are at the command of the theurgist. And there's a lot of examples of this. And, you know, there's tons of them in those various manuals that I mentioned. But an enlivened statue is at the command of the god who fills it with life. Now, just to be clear, it's not that the statue is the god, it's that it becomes a dedicated vessel for the god to use in order to have more easy influence and access to us on the physical plane. So, and it is at the control, once you create it, it's at the control of whichever god that is. So what that means, should you decide that you're going to take up Theurgy, or you already are a theurgist, is that when you are making a enlivened statue, it is the symbol of one god. You don't do a whole bunch of different gods all in one. It's one god because you're offering it as a vessel. And when you're doing that, you're going to incorporate as many signs, herbs, amulets, etc., as you can, all those different aspects that are creating that sympathetic resonance to give it strength, and to tie it more as closely as possible into that vibration so that it's a good vehicle. You'll do ritual purifications, fumigations, blessings, and so forth. And then once you do all that and you created something that would be a worthy vessel, then you do an invocation for the god and offer the statue as a vessel and ask for it to become an icon. And so again, that's what that is. It's an icon is an enlivened statue. Traditionally, obviously in Orthodox traditions, they're not necessarily statues, they're paintings, but in the Greek it would be a statue. A galmata. Now, another piece that is important is the personal daimon. So those of you who have studied your Plato know that Socrates was in conversation with his daimon. Before the soul finishes, actually, before it fully descends, I should say it's on its descent. The soul is descending back down in reincarnation into a body. A daimon is assigned by the god that would be in that chain to be a guide for that soul, and it becomes a model for the soul. And if you recall, like Socrates says that, he's in this conversation with his daimon. His daimon doesn't tell him what to do, but it sure does tell him when not to do something. And that's an important thing. That's the way in which it works for Socrates. But it binds the soul to the body as part of what the role is of the daimon during the descent from reincarnation back into incarnation. And it supervises and helps regulate the soul's life as a composite being, because again, we are both. Have the rational soul and we also have the irrational. And it guides up until, through Theurgy, the soul establishes the God again, in whose chain the soul resides, as the overseer and the leader of the soul. And after this, the daimon may either withdraw or subordinate itself to the God more directly and serve under the God's more direct instruction. So there are rites that Iamblichus discusses, but we don't have extant the actual working for this. The idea of invoking your personal daimon in order to be able to establish a more direct and clear communication with it. So the invocation is made in the name of the God that rules the daimon. So again, you kind of have to figure out enough about yourself to have a sense of whose chain you're in. And it could be the specific god of the theurgist is under a god's retinue and knows it. So I would call on Apollon. But if you don't know, you could call on the demiurge, because the demiurge is actually all the different gods are under the demiurge. When you then are successful in invoking the daimon, you ask it to reveal its name, the mode of worship proper to it, so how you honor it, and then the particular manner to summon it in the future, which is very similar to how, people who work with spirits, this is what we do. But again, we don't know what ritual was being used, but there are some similar, and I sent a handout that has some. They're kind of weird looking. And in terms of like, we have these various things, and you'll see some stuff there, Aeon, Zada Chotho. So, some of these kind of, I mentioned the Noma Babada, with that's some of the pieces there that are these names that are in some way resonating. And you'll see quite a few of them here. Now, I know actually I got into a conversation, I think, with Clifford here, who's on the call, where I was like, what does this mean where you have these male eggs? And I guess there's the theory of like, maybe they could tell based on the weight whether or not it's going to be like a hen or a rooster. But you can see here that it's kind of a strange thing, and I have not done this one. However, I did find that there is a newer book, Living Theurgy, A Course in Iamblichus' Philosophy and Theurgy, and I was investigating his ritual, which seems like something that would work better for a modern audience. Again, I have not had the chance to do this since I found that book. I've been kind of running nonstop, but it's like over a 7-day period, which I think is 7 days, which I think is a more realistic way if you want to do this kind of magic. But just to know that this is something that is there, that there are techniques for it, and there is someone who has done some work on creating a modern version of that. So wrapping up, some of the stuff that I wanted to suggest to people, should they be interested. You could, if you are interested, take a theurgical approach to many of your current practices, whatever it is that you are doing. I think this understanding of the nature of symbols is really useful. This idea that there are these gifts that are out there, that they are out there all over the place because the gods have given them to us, or the divine, however you understand it, and that if we can recognize them, and if we have the moral and emotional preparation to be able to grab them, then that can help us, because they're dropping through the veil, and you can grab them and go back up in a ascent. And also realizing that every time you're doing sacred work, however it is that you understand that, it is an opportunity for working towards divinization, towards creating more divinity within your own soul, further illumination, further energizing from the divine into you. I strongly encourage people, if they have any devotional bone in their body whatsoever, to incorporate prayer practice with invocations. I think it's really powerful. You can also look for various contemporary rituals, again, like there's the PGM, Hermetic corpus, and so forth.